Are you ready to break free from a conventional life and achieve financial independence through your version of tiny living, but you're feeling stuck trying to figure out the money part? Does the pressure to conform to societal norms make it even more difficult to embrace an unconventional lifestyle? Well, you're in the right place. I'm Laura Lynch, host of the Less House, More Moolah podcast, where every Thursday I'll bring you captivating interviews with individuals who have successfully made the transition to tiny living. They defied expectations and are thriving in their unique lives. We'll also dive deep into industry resources to address common financial concerns on your tiny journey. Together, we'll explore the emotional and practical aspects of pursuing an alternative lifestyle. I will describe a clear framework for project planning and cash flow management. Our goal is to intentionally build financial security and make a positive impact through our alternative American dream. So gear up for an exciting and empowering journey to create a life that truly resonates with you. Let's dive into today's episode and take the first steps towards financial independence and purpose through tiny living. Nicole Burgess, thank you so much for joining me on Less House, More Moolah. For podcast listeners who aren't watching on YouTube, I'm in the tiny house today, so haven't recorded here in quite a few months. So it's good to be back. And Nicole, you are, I guess, in your tiny too, but you're definitely planning your exit, which is going to be a great conversation that we're going to have today about letting go and moving on. So before we get to the nitty-gritty details of that, would you share with listeners how you first came to tiny living and how long you have been in the tiny community?
Yeah, so excited to be talking about this topic. This tiny has been such a huge part of my life for the past 4 years. In fact, it'll be 4 years exactly come December, which is really exciting to be doing that. And so tiny has been a part of my life for longer than I've lived here. Most people I find that go tiny, it's not a split-second decision. It's something that you sit and think on for a while. So I don't remember where the idea came from. I don't remember how long the slow burn was of kind of realizing that it might be for me. I do think that I started seriously considering tiny as a next stage of living in 2018. Which, knowing that I didn't move in until end of 2019, that's a decent amount of lead time. But I did spend a lot of that researching the lifestyle, researching builders, researching places where I could find land to live on. And I did use that time as well to try it out. So renting an Airbnb where I could spend a couple of days in a tiny and truly kind of solidify that interest and that feasibility for me that, I could do this. I could live in this space and this is what it would look like. And going to a tiny fest. So I went to my first tiny fest in 2018. And then I ended up signing on with my builder in the beginning of 2019 and getting my house towards the end of 2019. And I've been here ever since. We live on a ranch type property outside of the San Francisco Bay Area. And it's been a journey and it's been really great.
That's so awesome. I think that's so important. And a lot of guests talk about this contemplation and the need to, try it out before you jump into it, because it is quite an adjustment and certainly isn't for everyone. And it sounds like you definitely took your time to figure it out and, had probably a lot of excitement all those months while your house was being built. What sort of opposition did you face when you first kind of decided to do this unconventional thing?
I actually don't think I had a lot of opposition from like friends and family. There were concern, but it's supportive concern. So I think support looks like people that love you and people you love bringing concerns or things that can consider to your knowledge, to have you think those things through all the way to make sure that you're either mitigating those risks or planning, other ways around those if they were to come up, so that you're at least prepared if something was to happen. So I had friends and family that were concerned with, this isn't a good investment, or, this, you're going to hate this, and how are you going to fit into it? But a lot of it came from curiosity and support for this unconventional, and being able to see it for what it is, which is, this is love for me. This is support for me and my journey. This is wanting the best for me. And it's also coming from a place of, you don't want to give all of the power and all of your ears to people that aren't necessarily the experts. So giving them the space to provide the feedback based on where they're coming from, but not taking it to heart as experts in things that maybe they aren't the experts in. So then going to other places for, okay, how do I do this? So they bring the concerns, then I can address those and find the places, the avenues, the support groups, the communities where I can find those answers. The main place I think that I got a lot of the opposition was when I was trying to find land, because that is the hardest part, especially here in California and in the Bay Area specifically, is there are many ways of going about trying to find land. It's usually searching, reaching out to people. You don't always know if it's going to be viable or a scam. And the other way of finding land is not just searching, but also posting it yourself. So doing like an in search of post, either on Nextdoor or Craigslist or Facebook, to say, hey, I'm looking for land. Does someone have a yard or space or property where I could put my tiny house to live? This is what I would need utility wise. This is what it would look like. This is what I'm willing to spend, yada, yada, yada. There was some pushback that I received in comments where certain people had made assumptions that are usually derived from other living situations and other groups of people, or their own biases in how they see something from the outside. Again, not experts on it. And there are certain preconceived notions that they have, and then make those assumptions and then feel like they're justified in calling you out and demonizing you for something that they don't understand. So I did get a little bit of that, but it didn't make it a negative experience. It just came with the territory.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Anytime you put something out to the world, right, you are going to get a wide variety of responses these days, and everyone feels very free to express their opinions.
Yes.
So, and good to be sort of rooted in your own confidence and understand that everybody out there is not an expert and everybody isn't an authority. So you just have to, find those opportunities. And, like we were talking about a little bit before we got on the recording, it only takes one person to say yes to that parking opportunity. So what has been the thing that you have loved the most in the last 4 years in your tiny lifestyle?
As much anxiety as I gave myself throughout the process, designing my home from scratch was an absolute dream for me. It's also what I'm excited about for my next chapter as well, is the designing of the spatial planning, the from scratch, which again has a lot of anxiety associated with it. I think I had almost a panic attack over choosing the windows. I remember exactly where I was when I was having that. And it was interesting. It comes with the territory again. But being able to design the four walls and kind of think through all the aspects and really evaluate the life and like what you need and put your own stamp on it was very exciting for me. And I do love my house and I love so many aspects about it, but and this is me, like I have voice memos where I've tried to, okay, I'm letting this go. And part of reconciling that is like, okay, let's document everything. So like I have voice memos of all the things that I love about my house that could go 2 hours. So there isn't the time right now to discuss everything that I love about this house. I will say from the outside looking in, the most comments I get are about the outside design of the siding of my house. And inside I get a lot of, oh, this is a lot bigger than it looks like from the outside, because outside it looks like a box or a shipping container or storage or the back of a big rig truck. But inside it feels like a home, and the craftsmanship of the build has been I think, better than any one feature of the house. So just knowing that it's built well, it's built for me, that I trusted the builder, like all of that kind of came together is probably way beyond any one specific thing that I love about my house. The other thing that I would say is that just making the leap into tiny was such a huge deal for me that it was just a miracle that it even happened. And I'm an overthinker, so that comes as a blessing and a curse in that I can be really well prepared for whatever obstacle comes my way, but I may also never take a step down a certain path. So the fact that I did it, the fact that I took the leap to go tiny, like that was enough for me, and it gave me the confidence to know that I could make big decisions like that. I'd never bought a house before. I'd never built or designed a house before, really. So it gave me the confidence to know that I could make those big decisions, and an unconventional one at that, which is a little bit on brand for me. I do typically stray from the norm in some ways. But making unconventional choices means that you end up almost walking a path alone, which is why the community is so important and great, because you're not alone in it. But the infrastructure, there's a lot of things that come with an unconventional choice like that, and it can be very scary and very risky. So being able to make that leap despite those obstacles has been kind of a huge life pivot for me, knowing that I could, and actually doing it, kind of solidifying that belief that like you can make those choices, you can make those leaps, and you can still come out the other side.
Yeah. Yeah, it taught you to take risk, which is a really important lesson that we all need to learn, because if we never take any risks, we never do anything really great. So I think that, my tiny house definitely taught me similar lessons about bravery and grit and doing something, unconventional, and it being fine on the other side. And that just gives you the next little bit of risk taking for your next chapter. And so we've mentioned your next chapter a couple of times, but before we get to that, share with us a little bit about, as you're looking ahead to what you want to achieve next, how are you experiencing challenges in tiny living that's not sort of getting you down the path where you want to go?
I like to choose my words carefully when I answer questions about why I'm moving away from my tiny. And I think it's important to call attention to the fact that everyone moves and changes and has different phases of their life. And while tiny is unconventional, it does put this spotlight on the decisions that you make. And there can be an air of it's a fad or it's a trend. And in reality, everyone is making changes and entering different phases and leaving different phases of their life. And so when I built my tiny, I was in a certain phase of life. I was making certain decisions. I was making a certain amount of money, and I had certain goals and dreams and things that I wanted. And some of those haven't changed, and some of them have transformed, and they look different because I'm looking from a different lens. And so while my current living situation is not serving me, it doesn't mean that it's the tiny part that is not serving me. It just happens to be this certain circumstance. So when I made the decision, it took me a really long time. So I realized in January of this year that tiny was no longer serving me. And that took the form of many things. And when someone says like, well, what is the reason? What is the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak? And there isn't. It became a lot of little things that pointed me in the way of saying, you should be heading down a different direction. It's not this anymore. And it's not one particular thing that ended up driving me into a new phase of my life. It was this realization that I was ready for change and I was ready to try something new. And that couldn't happen if I was still holding on so tightly to this dream that I had years ago. I accomplished that dream. I lived that dream, and I loved that dream. And now I'm ready to try something new. And I'm not able to do it while holding on to that. And that's for various reasons. Those are, financial in order for me to fund the next dream. It's legalities for what I'm able to do with the tiny. If I was to keep it, there are restrictions on what I can do with that. And as much as I'd like to see those changed, they're not there yet. There are certain things that I envision for my future, and I've always wanted to own property, and to own property and have the tiny be the only, be the primary residence. It's not a thing that I can do without going different places. So depending on the different goals and things that I'm thinking of, I think I got away from the question.
No, I think that you answered the question and then kind of dipped into how you're processing this change. And I think that this is really a moment of learning a lesson that we all have to learn in this world that we live in, and that's living within the constraints of the world that it exists. Because there are all kinds of things that we can control and all kinds of things that we can't control. And in your situation, you can't have all the things that you want. So you can't have the tiny house and land and it all be legal, right? And so you have to move within the constraints that currently exist. And I think that that's a really important lesson that all of us have to face right now, because things are complicated. And especially in the tiny space, the legality is really complicated. And so understanding what can and can't be done, and to your point, primary residences of tiny houses, not as doable as maybe tiny houses ADU. So understanding the constraints, and that it's not a bad mark on tiny living or walking away from that dream. It's just operating within the system that exists.
Yeah. Operating within the system, the space, the location. Yeah. It became kind of little things about all of those. And you're right, you can't have everything, even when you're doing like a regular house hunt. I mean, that's why House Hunters is so great, is they show 3 potential houses that someone is thinking of purchasing, and each one has pros and cons, and you're not usually going to get everything, and you have to prioritize what you are willing to compromise on, and what are your deal breakers, and what you're really trying to get out of this next leap. Yeah. And that looks like, again, the location of where I'm at, the space that I have, the legalities of what I can do with it. I thought about, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do next. And so it became the thought process was, I don't know what's next. And that was a really hard thing to answer to people when I got the question of, oh, you're selling your house, where are you going next? And it almost has to be a huge value add. It almost has to be like this huge change where you have to give up this thing, and it has to be amazing. Like, oh, well, you have this grand plan. And all I knew was that I was ready for this change, and that every avenue that I thought of didn't include the tiny house, unfortunately. And making that pivot meant that I had to let it go. And I spun my wheels dry trying to figure out how I could have my cake and eat it too. And coming to terms with that not being a way forward. I realized that I was going to make myself stuck if I could not let go of what I had in order to jump into the next. So I thought about, how can I get a house and a house with property big enough to put the tiny house, while not needing the sale of the house in order to get the house, but then also for it to be legal to put the house. So I looked at the ordinances of the house that we've been moving into, and it specifically calls out that you cannot have tinies as an ADU, which it's only legal in some places. And then in other places, the language just isn't there. But for it to be specifically called out was just another sign of, okay, this can't be part of your next way forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's hard for us to let go of things, whether it's our tiny house or, whether it's a relationship or, whatever it is that we have to let go of in life, just to kind of accept the fact that the next iteration of what we're trying to achieve doesn't have room for something in the past is really hard, because it's hard to understand deep within ourselves why we were so into one thing 5 years ago, or so committed to one thing 5 years ago, and then you change. But we all change over time, and we all go through processes of development over time, and to kind of accept that as a reality and just embrace that, and look at it as the unexpected things that are around the corner, requires, some optimism and flexibility, and kind of letting go of our past self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
So as you are sort of making this transition, and you're, kind of getting close to your new future, what are the key takeaways that you have from tiny living that help sort of inform your next chapter? What have you learned in the last 4 years that you take with you?
There's a certain mentality that I think most people that go tiny have, where they have, as you said, that risk-taking ability, or the confidence to go forward, or the acceptance that the norm is not the only way. And having been able to put that into practice is something that I take away from living tiny, is that it doesn't have to look like everyone else's, which is a really easy thing to say. It's not such an easy thing to do, especially like even with a transaction, the real estate market, like there's taxes, there's real estate, there's escrow, there's all these infrastructure things put into place to allow for the transfer of home ownership that don't exist with tinies. So you have to figure that out yourself. And when you're looking for land, there's a bunch of different ways that you could end up living tiny. So being creative, accepting the different ways that something could come to fruition, I think those are really important mindsets to have just in life. But it becomes something very important to tiny living, and something that I can take away and I can utilize in other aspects of my life. And I feel that I do.
Yeah. Being independent of and creative of thought.
Yes, that's a great way to put it.
Awesome. So, one of the things that maybe people bring up when you think about a season of tiny living, which, tiny living is a great season, right? It allows you to perhaps save money for a next chapter of your life. This is something that Alexis actually brought up when I interviewed her too. Tiny living has a lot of purposes, and it doesn't have to be forever. But people, I think, kind of have this concept that you're missing out on the housing market during that time. So what do you think, if you kind of compare where things were back in 2019, and now looking forward and you're getting into a foundation house now, do you feel like that you lost time out of the normal housing market by taking this transition, or has ultimately the sale of the tiny house kind of bridged that gap, or how do you sort of process that?
Yeah, I'd say it's more along the lines of bridging that gap. I think in order to think about missing out in the market, you have to have a foot in the door. And when I was going tiny, I didn't have a foot in the door. I didn't have the means of even really, I barely had the means for renting an apartment by myself where I live, because it's so expensive to live in the Bay Area. That was one of the reasons why I went tiny. One of many reasons. Friends, family, everyone is either paired up or has a living situation already buckled down, or they have roommates, or, they're starting a family. The ability for me to rent an apartment or a house or any other situation that didn't involve me couch surfing on, in friends' living rooms, it was not feasible. So I could have gone the traditional route of trying to find an apartment and pay rent, but I've not really acclimated to that norm of wanting to throw money away at rent. Now I do throw money away at rent because I rent the property that I'm on now, but it is less. And I am afforded the ability to have my four walls, and I have, this great view in nature around me. And I've crafted what I want out of the experience versus signing up for what could have been my only option. Mm-hmm. So in terms of thinking about missing out on the housing market, I didn't have the ability to be in the housing market back then. And I consider myself a saver, and the idea of throwing rent away. So I didn't know where I was going with Tiny, how long I was going to live in it, what it might look like. I had ideas. I had all of these side plans where maybe I buy property and I put it in the back and it becomes rental, or maybe I sell it and I get a house, or I, put it in the back of a house and then rent out the main. Like, there's so many things that I thought about doing. And what it allowed me to do is keep my options open. Mm-hmm. And that's what I loved, is not just the flexibility about where you can go, although there is less flexibility about where you can go because of the legalities and the space permitted. It did allow me to save some money once I was able to pay the house off. And it did allow me to get to the place now where I can go get a foundation home and I can enter the housing market. And it was a goal of mine to eventually get there. Mm-hmm. But I don't feel that I missed out on anything because I didn't have the opportunity or the circumstances to be able to be part of it. So I didn't feel like I missed out. And when I view that, it's more from the lens of like, where am I? Not what I'm missing out on. Because if it's not an option for me, then I can't dwell on the fact that I can't be a part of it.
Yeah. And in reality, I mean, would you agree that the tiny house was your stepping stone into the foundation house, from the standpoint that allowed you to stack some money away, and now you have an asset that you're selling that's helping you get into your next house?
Yes, absolutely. And I didn't know that was going to be a thing when I started. Again, I kind of have to just set myself up for whatever my future vision might look like, because I don't know, I can't predict it. But if I can set myself up and be financially savvy enough to be available and in the right position to accept certain decisions that I want to make in the future, then I'm making the right choices. Yeah. And I was able to use this as the stepping stone, not having known what I was going to be using it for when I started. And when I was getting kind of those, not pushback, but the supportive concern comments about it being a terrible investment, it's entirely possible that it would have been. But the goal was not for it to be an investment. The goal was not for it to be the stepping stone. The goal was for it to be a way that I could live. I had to think about the present, not just the future. Yeah. So like, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And so I prepared for it to be depreciation. I prepared for it to be a loss. I just was looking for the next step of how can I get into my own space that I can design, that I have control over, versus signing up for the norm of getting an apartment.
Yeah. I wondered, since you have had your tiny house on the market, what have you gathered about the tiny house movement, the interest of people, kind of, do you feel like that there's more interest than when you first got started? Kind of, what are your takeaways from putting your house up for sale?
I think that there's more awareness that, and there's still people that you say you live in a tiny house and they think that you mean that your house is just tiny. But there seems to be more of an awareness, and there does seem to be more of an interest. I feel that a lot of it comes with a kind of head in the clouds, pie in the sky kind of hope and dream that it could be the answers to everything. I've gotten questions before I even put the house for sale from people that, acquaintances and friends that wanted to know the feasibility of them going tiny, and if it was exactly what they were thinking in terms of a savings, in terms of an ideal lifestyle, in terms of everything that they're seeing either on the shows or in social media, which I do think that has helped with the awareness. But in terms of the understanding of the lifestyle and the movement, I feel that there has been a track upwards, but there's still places to go. There's definitely interest. there's a lot of questions. And I think that the next stage of getting to a place where it is more normalized or it is more accepted is to go through that phase of all the questions. So I think we've gotten to a point where there's more awareness and we're in a phase of asking questions about it. And I think that's really powerful and great for the projections of the movement, because all of the thoughts around it being a fad or a trend just don't seem to be holding up.
Yeah. And so what do you think needs to happen to enable more people to go tiny?
I think the ordinances, the municipalities, the legalities need to change. And there are groups working on that. THEA would be one of them, the Tiny House Industry Association. And they have local chapters in many corners of the US that are working towards legalizing tiny in different ways. One of the major ways is to legalize them as movable ADUs. That can be a great first step forward. Eventually, I'd like to see empty lots become primary residences for tiny homes. I think that having a dialogue with community members, with planning commissions, to have a conversation about how about how to have a mutually beneficial arrangement between tiny dwellers and government or regional areas and city councils. There's a lot that can be done there. And I have a lot of ideas, and it can be very hard to have that dialogue. But I think as long as we're asking questions, as long as we are exercising our right to say this is something that is important to the community and important to the way of moving forward, especially with the housing crisis, that it's for more people. It is not just for people trying to save money. It is not just for those that are currently unhoused. It is for a wide variety of people. And as long as that is understood and that is not extrapolated into preconceived notions of how certain people live, that this is an entirely different subset of living, and that this movement is trying to better communities, not tear them down. I think that that's the way forward.
So other than THEA, who else do you think needs to take responsibility for this, for kind of next action and making progress on the legalization front?
I wish I knew. I think that there is something to be said for community members, for people that live in communities to drive that forward. So just normal citizens. But I think that it comes to the councils and the planning commissions to be able to start the conversations and accept the dialogue. But I wish I knew who the right person is to own that. And I think that is a challenge going forward. The organizations like THEA that can drive those missions is great, but in terms of like who should own it and where that next step is, I think when we figure that out, we'll make a lot more headway.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your take on things and the way that you have been so thoughtful about your beautiful time in Tiny, what you're taking away from it, how you're moving forward, and how you're processing that transition. And I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. Is there anything that we did not cover today that you want to make sure that you mention?
I think that there is so much to discuss about Tiny, and it is one of a couple things that I could talk anyone's ear off about. So in the essence of time, I'm going to say no. But if there are other questions or there are other topics, again, I can talk about Tiny till the cows come home. And I love talking about Tiny. And just because I am leaving my current tiny house doesn't mean I'm not going to come back to it. And I love the idea of helping people on their way, even those that are coming to me right now with questions or, the feasibility asks of, is this right for me? Maybe my house that currently on the market, hopefully being sold soon, may not be right for everyone. But there are builders out there. There are other secondhand tinies out there. There are resources that I have many friends You are one of them. Tiny House Concierge is another one of them. The Tuttle Shuttle has resources on their website. There are tons of places where you can get information about how to go tiny, both financially, builder-wise, secondhand, logistics, finding parking. Tiny House Expedition has put out multiple articles on how to find parking for tiny houses. Getting in touch with like your local chapters or getting in touch with Thea in order to perpetuate the legality changes that are necessary for the tiny house movement. I think as long as everyone knows that the conversation can always continue, I think that's the best takeaway.
Awesome. That's a great one. Just all of us need to keep the conversation going and keep the conversation going in the community in which you want to live. And within the tiny living community, there's so many resources out there. So Nicole, if someone wanted to contact you or follow you, where would they do that?
So I have a website, NicoleLise.com, NicoleLise.com. There's a contact form there that I can be reached on so that conversation can continue. I am building out services there, but for the most part, I just is looking for a fun conversation with people because it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I can also be reached at on Instagram at From the Tiny Home, and that has pictures of my house, and it's a great community. And if you're looking for connection with tiny house dreamers and dwellers and builders, I have found Instagram to be a great community of people.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insight and your mental and emotional journey as you're in the thick of that transition. Your introspection is super valuable. So Nicole, thanks for sharing that with us.
Thank you so much, Laura. I look forward to seeing your other podcast topics on it.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Less House, More Moolah. To access valuable financial tips and resources tailored to your tiny living journey, join our exclusive community at thetinyhouseadvisor.com. Here you'll find a supportive network of like-minded individuals committed to helping each other navigate the challenges and celebrate the victories of embracing a minimalist lifestyle. So don't miss out on the opportunity to be part of this empowering tribe. Be sure to tune in next Thursday for another insightful episode of Less House, More Moolah, where we'll continue to explore practical solutions and inspiring stories to help you create the life you've always dreamed of.
Please see the show notes for important disclosure regarding the Tiny House Advisor LLC and this episode.